She vanished with the words, "You betrayed me." 3 years later, the millionaire froze. She was back, and she wasn't alone. Evan Miller had always been the kind of man who believed control was the key to success. At 34, as the CEO of Vantage Technologies, he was the picture of corporate triumph, tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see a few moves ahead of everyone else. In the boardroom, his voice carried weight, his decisions shaped markets. Yet in his personal life, those same instincts often became weapons. Lauren Carter had entered his world quietly, not with an impressive resume or corporate connections, but with a grounded warmth that disarmed him. She had rich brown hair that caught the light like polished wood, deep brown eyes that didn't flinch under his gaze, and a way of asking questions that made him consider answers he'd never rehearsed. They had met at a conference where she was consulting on community engagement for one of Vantage's outreach projects. For months afterward, their conversations spilled out beyond work. Late-night phone calls, long walks, shared meals where business talk was quickly abandoned for stories about childhood and half-forgotten dreams. Evan had felt something with her that he rarely allowed himself: vulnerability. But when the company began gearing up for an aggressive expansion and IPO, that vulnerability became something he was told to eliminate. Advisors and board members, men and women who measured life in quarterly returns, began warning him that any complications in his personal life could distract from the image they needed to sell. Lauren, they implied, was not a scandal but a risk factor, someone whose values didn't align with the high-stakes corporate theater about to unfold. The whispers became strategy, and Evan, so used to thinking in terms of calculated moves, convinced himself that ending things was the smartest decision. It happened on a rainy evening in his penthouse, the skyline lit up behind them. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, speaking in the same calm tone he used when delivering bad news to a client. He told her the timing wasn't right, that she deserved someone who could give her more than the scraps of attention he could spare, and finally, almost as if to close the deal, he added, "This is for the best." Lauren didn't cry or plead. She simply looked at him for a long moment, as though memorizing the exact man standing in front of her, then said quietly, "You betrayed me." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of her perfume and a hollow silence that the city lights couldn't fill. In the days that followed, Evan threw himself into work, telling himself he had avoided unnecessary drama and made the right choice. What he didn't realize was that her absence would linger in ways he couldn't shake. He had no idea where she went, and no one around him seemed to know either. She had disappeared completely, taking with her not just the comfort of her presence but a piece of him he didn't yet understand he had lost. In the 3 years that followed Lauren's departure, Evan's professional life became a relentless cycle of victories that felt strangely hollow. Vantage Technologies expanded into new markets, signed high-profile contracts, and rode the momentum of a record-breaking IPO. He was lauded in business magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and held up as the example of a self-made leader with an unshakable focus. Yet every evening, when the noise of the day faded and the city lights blinked outside his penthouse windows, he was left with the same heavy quiet that had settled the night she walked out. He told himself that he had traded distraction for discipline, that success required sacrifices, and that missing her was simply a symptom of having once let someone get too close. But the truth was harder. There was a gap in his life that no amount of business milestones could fill. Lauren, meanwhile, had built a different world far from the glass and steel towers Evan inhabited. She had moved to a modest coastal town where the air smelled of salt and pine, and where people cared less about her resume than about whether she'd join the community bake sale. She took a job teaching at the local elementary school, finding comfort in routine and in the unpretentious kindness of her neighbors. But the most important part of her life came quietly, just months after she left Evan: the birth of twin boys. Liam and Lucas were mirror images of each other, with soft golden hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold more depth than their years could explain. From the beginning, Lauren knew she would raise them on her own. She told herself it was to protect them from the instability of Evan's world and from the possibility that he might see them as an inconvenience or a liability rather than as his children. Life with the boys was both exhausting and profoundly fulfilling. Lauren learned to function on fragmented sleep, to juggle teaching with late-night feedings, and to stretch her modest income to cover everything from doctor's visits to growing piles of laundry. She didn't speak of their father, but sometimes, when she caught the twins looking up at her with those unmistakable blue eyes, she felt a pang of conflict. There were moments she imagined what Evan might say or do if he knew, then just as quickly reminded herself of the man who had chosen ambition over her, the one who had looked her in the eye and decided she wasn't worth the risk. Yet the past has a way of pressing against the present when least expected. The boys were approaching their third birthday when a troubling diagnosis began to cloud the small, stable life Lauren had created. It started with routine checkups, tiny irregularities in their heartbeats that the pediatrician thought worth investigating. What followed were specialist visits, scans, and long conversations filled with terms she struggled to absorb. By the time the cardiologist confirmed they would both need surgical intervention, the weight of the situation settled fully on her shoulders. She was determined to handle it alone, just as she always had, but in the quiet hours of the night, watching her son sleep, the thought she had avoided for 3 years began to surface again. If there was ever a time Evan Miller needed to know the truth, it might be now. She just didn't yet know how, or if, she could bring herself to make that call. The day Lauren's world and Evan's collided again began like any other, with her balancing the chaos of getting Liam and Lucas ready for a morning appointment. The boys were restless, chattering to each other in a private language only twins seemed to understand, their small hands clutching toy cars as she tried to coax them into their jackets. The cardiology follow-up had been scheduled for weeks, and she had steeled herself for whatever the doctors might say, but she hadn't planned for the detour fate had arranged. The hospital they visited was in the city, hours from their quiet coastal town, and the return trip required them to pass through the regional airport. It was there, in the bright expanse of the arrivals terminal, that the moment happened. Evan was stepping off a flight from New York, his mind still tangled in the threads of a high-stakes negotiation, when his gaze swept the terminal and caught on a figure he thought his memory had finally softened. Lauren was standing near the exit, her brown hair falling over her shoulder, her hand steady on the small shoulders of 2 identically blonde boys. For a beat, his mind refused to connect the pieces. The boy's blue eyes, his eyes, watched the crowd with curious wariness, and the air around him seemed to shift. The noise of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and hurried footsteps dimmed beneath the rush of his heartbeat. Lauren saw him at almost the same moment. Her posture changed instantly, she straightened, her expression guarded, as though bracing for impact. Evan, still a few strides away, searched her face for something familiar beyond the walls she had built. He noticed how her features had matured in the years apart, the faint shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, and the subtle strength in the way she held herself. The boys, sensing her sudden stillness, turned to look at him directly. That single moment of eye contact was like being pulled into a mirror that reflected not just the present, but all the choices that had led there. They didn't speak in the terminal. She guided the boys toward the cafe just past security, clearly intent on privacy. He followed, not close enough to seem intrusive, but without losing sight of them. When they finally sat at a small table in the corner, she gestured for him to join them, her tone calm but edged with a quiet warning. The boys remained close, leaning into her sides, their small faces a blend of curiosity and caution. Evan sat opposite, unsure whether to start with an apology, a question, or the truth that had just crashed over him. Lauren saved him the choice. She told him their names, Liam and Lucas, and, without softening the impact, the reality of their health. They had been diagnosed with congenital heart defects, and while both were managing for now, the doctors agreed surgery was inevitable. He listened, his usual instinct to control a situation overridden by the simple fact that there was nothing to control, only the weight of what had been hidden from him and the understanding of why she had done it. She spoke without anger, but also without apology, explaining that she hadn't wanted their lives tangled in the machinery of his ambition, that she'd been determined to protect them from being an afterthought in a world that prized profit over people. Yet here they were, in a moment neither of them had planned, with two small boys sitting between them whose future might depend on decisions made in the next few weeks. When she finished, the silence at the table was almost tangible. The boys sipped juice from paper cups, oblivious to the storm above their heads. Evan looked at them, then at her, and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way no corporate loss or victory had ever done. This was not a boardroom problem to be solved, it was a life already in motion, one he had been absent from, and one he suddenly knew he could no longer stay away from. Lauren had not intended to tell Evan as much as she did that day in the cafe, but once the truth about Liam and Lucas's condition was out, it seemed impossible to stop there. She described the appointments, the tense hours in waiting rooms with the boys distracted by coloring books while she tried to memorize every word from the cardiologists. She told him about the surgical timelines the doctors were already drafting and how the procedures, especially for children so young, would require a team of specialists, extended recovery time, and meticulous follow-up care. The costs were staggering, not just in money but in her ability to keep her job and care for both boys at once. She had done everything she could to prepare herself for the road ahead, but the reality was daunting. Evan listened with an uncharacteristic stillness. He wasn't making mental notes on strategy or looking for the angle that would benefit him, he was taking in every word as if it were the only thing that mattered. He could see the toll these years had taken on her, the way her voice carried a certain fatigue that went deeper than lack of sleep, the guardedness in her eyes that seemed to brace for disappointment before it could arrive. When she spoke about the boys, however, something in her expression softened. There was a fierce love there, an unshakable resolve that reminded him of why he had once been drawn to her in the first place. He asked why she had never told him about them before. Lauren didn't hesitate with her answer, because she hadn't trusted that he would choose them over the demands of his career, and because she didn't want them to be an afterthought in a life built around image and profit. "I left to protect them," she said, "and maybe to protect myself too. But that doesn't mean I ever stopped thinking about what it would mean for them not to know you." Her honesty was like a quiet blade, it didn't wound him with volume, but with precision. For a moment, he considered defending himself, pointing out the pressures he'd been under, the constant counsel from his board, the timing of the IPO. But the words felt hollow before they left his mouth. The truth was simpler, he had made a choice back then, and it was one he couldn't undo. Now, he was faced with another choice, one that mattered far more. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm, and told her he wanted to help, not from obligation or guilt, but because they were his children too. He promised to cover the medical expenses, to arrange consultations with top pediatric surgeons, and to be present for whatever came next. Lauren studied him in silence for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in his eyes against the history between them. Finally, she nodded, though her expression held no trace of surrender, only cautious acceptance. "If you're in this," she said, "you're in it all the way. No disappearing when it gets hard, no letting someone else make decisions for you. They don't need a visitor, Evan. They need a father." The weight of that word settled over him like armor and responsibility all at once. By the time they left the cafe, the air between them had shifted. The years apart hadn't erased the past, but something unspoken had taken root, a recognition that whatever battles lay ahead, they would have to fight them side by side. As they stepped back into the bustle of the terminal, the boys each holding one of her hands, Evan fell into step beside them, silently matching his pace to theirs for the first time. The weeks leading up to the surgeries blurred into a rhythm of hospital visits, consultations, and constant phone calls that seemed to stretch late into every night. Lauren balanced her teaching duties as best she could, but her mind was consumed by the upcoming procedures for Liam and Lucas. Every new test result was another piece of the puzzle the cardiologists needed to decide the safest approach, and each appointment carried its own mix of hope and dread. Evan, true to his word, involved himself completely. He rearranged his travel schedule, cancelled speaking engagements, and set up meetings with specialists he trusted from across the country. It was the first time in years he had given himself wholly to something without weighing its potential return, and he found the shift disorienting but grounding. In the hospital corridors, his presence was impossible to miss. He wasn't the polished figure from magazine covers. He was often in worn jeans and a plain shirt, leaning over clipboards with surgeons, asking about recovery protocols, or simply sitting beside the boys as they played with building blocks on the waiting room floor. Lauren watched him closely in those moments, noting the small but unmistakable changes in his demeanor, how he knelt to meet the boys at eye level, how he listened to their rambling stories without checking his phone, how his expression softened whenever they instinctively reached for his hand. Despite their cooperative front, tension lingered between him and Lauren, not out of hostility, but from the unspoken weight of their shared history. There were nights when they would both remain in the hospital's family lounge long after the boys had fallen asleep, sipping lukewarm coffee and speaking in measured tones. She asked him more than once if he was sure he could handle this, not just the financial cost, but the emotional toll. He always answered the same way, not with promises of perfection, but with a steady assurance that he wasn't leaving. The morning the surgeries were scheduled, the air in the pediatric wing felt different, heavier. The boys were prepped in adjacent rooms, each with a small stuffed animal clutched in his arms. Lauren stayed with Lucas while Evan accompanied Liam, each of them dividing their focus but united in purpose. They exchanged brief nods in the hallway, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever happened in the operating rooms, they were in it together. When the double doors finally swung shut behind the gurneys, Lauren sank into one of the rigid waiting room chairs, and Evan sat beside her without saying a word. They waited in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the only thing either of them wanted, to see their son safe and whole, was beyond words. Hours passed with updates trickling in from the surgical teams. Every time a nurse emerged, both of them would stand in unison, bracing themselves. The waiting was its own kind of trial, testing patience and faith in equal measure. For Evan, used to solving problems through decisive action, the helplessness was almost unbearable. For Lauren, who had carried this responsibility alone for so long, sharing the burden, really sharing it, felt both foreign and unexpectedly relieving. In that waiting room, without the armor of their past grievances, they began to see each other not as the people they had been, but as the parents their boys needed them to be. When the surgeons finally emerged from the operating rooms, their faces carried the cautious relief of professionals who had navigated a delicate path and come through on the other side. They explained that both Liam and Lucas had responded well to the procedures, the repairs had gone as planned, and while recovery would be slow and carefully monitored, the prognosis was hopeful. Lauren felt her knees weaken at the news, an almost dizzying release of tension after so many weeks of fear. Evan, standing beside her, let out a slow breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It was not the loud cheer of a man celebrating a victory, it was quieter, heavier, the sound of someone accepting the magnitude of what could have been lost. The boys were moved to the pediatric recovery wing, each in their own bed but close enough that Lauren could sit between them and hold a hand from each side. Their faces were pale against the hospital sheets, small chests rising and falling with the steady rhythm of machines assisting their breathing. Evan stayed, refusing to leave even when the nurses assured him there was nothing more for him to do. He paced the room in slow, measured steps, stopping to adjust a blanket or brush a stray lock of hair from a forehead, his expression fixed in a way that suggested he was memorizing every detail. Those first hours of recovery were marked by quiet exchanges between him and Lauren. She thanked him for being there, not out of politeness, but with the sincerity of someone who had been prepared to carry the weight alone and was surprised to find it shared. He admitted that seeing them like this was harder than anything he had faced in business, that no amount of skill or influence could control the uncertainty that came with being a parent. They spoke about practical matters, medication schedules, follow-up appointments, the possibility of home nursing, but beneath those conversations was a growing undercurrent of something unspoken, a fragile understanding that they were rebuilding trust, not in a rush, but moment by moment. When the boys finally began to wake, groggy and disoriented, Lauren leaned close to soothe them, her voice soft and steady. Evan stepped into view slowly, not wanting to overwhelm them. Liam blinked at him first, then Lucas, their small hands reaching out in unison. Without hesitation, he took them both, one in each hand, feeling the warmth of their fingers curl around his. The moment was wordless, yet it carried a weight far beyond any declaration he could have made. It was the first time they touched their father knowing who he was, and something about that recognition settled deeply in him. That night, Lauren stayed curled in a chair between their beds, refusing the cot the nurses had brought. Evan sat across from her, his posture still straight but his gaze softer than she'd ever seen. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. The steady hum of monitors and the slow breathing of their sons filled the silence. For the first time since she had left him years ago, Lauren felt not just supported, but partnered. And for the first time in his life, Evan felt the full gravity of what it meant to be a father, not as a title, but as a choice he would keep making, every single day. The days following the surgeries unfolded in a rhythm that was at once exhausting and strangely grounding, as if the hospital had become its own self-contained world. The bright daylight filtering through the blinds, the hum of medical machines, and the faint antiseptic smell formed the backdrop to long hours of waiting for small signs of progress. Liam and Lucas, though sore and easily tired, were showing gradual improvement with each passing day. The first time Liam managed a weak smile at the nurse who brought his juice, Lauren nearly cried, and when Lucas mustered enough energy to ask Evan to read him a picture book, it felt like a quiet victory that neither parent took for granted. Evan had slipped fully into the role of being there, not in the occasional, performative way she had once feared, but in the constant, steady presence of someone who understood that the smallest moments could be as critical as the big ones. He learned how to help adjust the boys' 4 lines without pulling at the tubing, memorized their medication times, and even started tracking their progress on a small notepad. There was nothing glamorous in the work, but he embraced it as if it were the most important deal of his life. At night, after the boys drifted off, he and Lauren would often step into the hallway for a few minutes to let the nurses do their rounds. Those talks were different from their earlier exchanges, less about the past, more about the present, and sometimes even daring to touch on the future. It was in one of those late-night conversations, leaning against the cool wall outside the recovery ward, that Lauren admitted she had spent years preparing herself for the possibility that he might someday appear in their lives again. She had imagined what she would say, how she would keep him at a safe emotional distance, but the reality had unraveled differently. Seeing him care for their sons with a patience and dedication she had never known in him before had shifted something inside her. Evan listened without trying to defend himself, and instead told her that watching her raise them alone had been both humbling and painful because he hadn't been there, and humbling because she had managed to create something so steady without him. The following week, as the boys grew stronger, Evan began making quiet arrangements behind the scenes. He contacted one of the top pediatric cardiology rehabilitation programs in the country and secured spots for both Liam and Lucas. He arranged for a private nurse to assist at home during the early recovery phase, not to replace Lauren's care, but to ensure she wouldn't bear the weight alone. When he told her about these plans, she looked at him for a long moment before simply saying, "I don't need you to fix everything. I just need you to stay." His answer was simple, "I'm not going anywhere." The day came when the doctors announced that the boys were well enough to be discharged. The moment was both joyous and frightening, because leaving the safety of the hospital meant stepping back into a world where every decision felt higher stakes. Lauren packed their things while Evan handled the discharge paperwork, and together they wheeled the boys out into the crisp air of a late afternoon. For the first time in years, they left a place side by side, not as strangers burdened by their history, but as two parents carrying the same hope forward. And as they drove toward Lauren's home, with the boys asleep in the back seat, it felt less like a return to old wounds and more like the fragile, deliberate beginning of something new. At home, the atmosphere was a strange mix of relief and fragility. The boys were no longer surrounded by the constant beeping of monitors, yet the memory of those sounds still lingered in everyone's mind. The living room had been transformed into a recovery space, with soft blankets laid out, a small medical station set up in the corner, and the nurse Evan had hired quietly taking notes on their vitals. Lauren moved through the house with practiced precision, managing medications, preparing light meals, and keeping track of the twins' activity levels. Evan, no longer the occasional visitor in their lives, had taken to spending most of his days there, his laptop pushed aside more often than not as he chose to sit with the boys while they napped or played. It took time for the twins to adjust to their father's constant presence. At first, they would still look to Lauren for reassurance whenever Evan suggested something, reading a story, building blocks, or helping them down the steps to the backyard. Gradually, though, their hesitation faded. Lucas started asking for him in the mornings, and Liam began tugging at his hand whenever he wanted to show off a new drawing. Evan was careful never to push too hard, giving them space to come to him in their own time. Lauren noticed the subtle changes too, the way Evan seemed to measure his words more carefully, the way he studied their moods like a man trying to learn a language for the first time, determined not to make a mistake that would cost him their trust. Evenings became a quiet ritual. After the boys had gone to bed, Evan and Lauren would find themselves in the kitchen, talking over mugs of tea. Sometimes the conversations were light, filled with small observations about the day, and sometimes they edged into deeper territory. Lauren began to share pieces of the years he had missed, the first time the twins had laughed in sync, the night she had stayed up worrying through their first fevers, the morning she'd carried both of them to daycare while half asleep. Evan listened without interrupting, letting her paint a picture of a life he hadn't been there for but wanted desperately to be part of from now on. There were difficult moments, too. The boys had nightmares more than once in those early weeks, waking up crying from dreams they couldn't fully explain. Lauren would rush to their room, but she began to notice Evan getting there just as quickly, sometimes even before her. He didn't always know the right words, but he learned quickly that sometimes all they needed was for him to sit on the edge of the bed and hold their hands until they fell back asleep. Those nights left him wide awake long after the house had gone quiet, realizing that being a father wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the smallest, most consistent acts of showing up. As spring began to creep in, the boys grew stronger. The nurses' visits became less frequent, and their doctors cleared them for short walks outside. Evan was there for the first time they ventured to the park together, a small victory that felt larger than any award or business milestone he'd ever achieved. Watching the twins run toward the swings, their laughter carried on the breeze, he glanced at Lauren, and for the first time in years, there was no guarded distance in her expression, only the quiet acknowledgement of a shared triumph. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, Evan stepped outside to the porch where Lauren was sitting with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He sat beside her, and for a while, they didn't speak. Finally, he told her he wasn't just staying because of the boys, he was staying because he wanted to be part of her life again too, if she would let him. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't look away either. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden embrace, just a slow, deliberate understanding passing between them in the quiet night air. In that moment, they both knew that what they were building was fragile, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something they could face together. In my view, this story is proof that life does offer second chances, but they never take you back to the exact place where everything began. This isn't a cliché, happily ever after, it's a journey through mistakes, loss, and the realization that love and family aren't just feelings, but choices you must prove with your actions every day. I like that the ending isn't loud or theatrical, but quiet, and that makes it even more powerful. The characters aren't magically brought back together by fate, they make the conscious decision to move toward each other, despite fear and past hurt. This isn't a story about perfect people, but about those who learn to become a better version of themselves for someone who matters more than their own ego. The most valuable part of this ending is that it leaves room for the future. We can see their life ahead will still be challenging, but now they have a shared desire and willingness to face it together, and that's stronger than any words or promises.